Well, let me begin my homage to Michael with this print. This is a early 20th century temperance print that I use in many of my talks for various different things. And to first of all describe my career and how I'm wound up being here. In my dissertation in the 70s, I worked on the question of what do we know about deterrence. And that was back at a time when I had a lot more hair, and my colleague Phil Cook, we were both assistant professors at Duke. Phil has kept all of his hair, but it's all turned white in the meantime. And so for the early part of my career, the focus of my work was on deterrence. And then I became interested in the question, mostly because of the work of David Farrington, who unfortunately can't be with us, about the question of why it is that people commit crimes in the first place, and understanding the developmental course of crimes and why it is that some people follow this life course versus that life course. But then when I was in the middle of this work in the mid-90s, I was at a criminology meeting, and Mike came to me and said, I'd like you to write an essay for Crime and Justice on deterrence. And it's an essay that wound up appearing in 1998. And when Mike asked me to do it, at the time I was hesitant to do it because I was so involved in my developmental work. But I agreed, and I want to thank Mike for I want to thank Mike for convincing me to do this, because it's brought me back to this important question. It brought me back to doing collaborations with people at the Netherlands Institute for Crime and Law Enforcement on the effects of imprisonment, the effect of imprisonment on reoffending, and more generally asking these questions about what do we know about the deterrent effect of sanctions, which I talk about in this essay. So the topics of this essay, the issues that I cover, are first of all the theory of deterrence, and in this review of the theory of deterrence, one thing that struck me was how important and enduring the ideas of Bentham and Beccaria in particular were on still our current thinking about deterrence. And so it really is that all of this research is an enduring legacy to their work. On the other hand, I also came to the conclusion that it doesn't speak well to the theoretical developments that have followed, that there's been so little development of ideas that are now 250 years old. And in this essay, I try to lay out what I think are major theoretical gaps in our thinking about deterrence, and I'll briefly at least allude to some of those. There's also a lot of many pages given to the question of what is the deterrent effect of imprisonment, and in fact, that's what I'm going to focus most of my comments on today. There's also a discussion of policing, which I will also somewhat talk about, but Larry went on at length about that earlier. I also, as Mike discussed, I do talk about capital punishment, but I've been talking a lot about capital punishment over the last couple of weeks, and so I'm not going to. I'm tired of talking about capital punishment, and so I'm going to talk about those other topics. And then finally, I also talk about the issue of sanction risk perceptions and how important it is that we understand sanction risk perceptions, because after all, in the end, if there's a deterrent effect, it depends on how people perceive these sanctions, and we know very little about that. And that's something we need to know much more about, and which is actually an issue which is emphasized in the capital punishment report. So, this is a graph that still another graph showing the rising imprisonment rates in the United States. I don't have to elaborate on it. Mike already has. But I also want to point out that rising imprisonment rates are not a uniquely American phenomenon. It's happening elsewhere in the world. For example, this is a graph of the imprisonment rates in the Netherlands from a volume that actually Mike edited. And what you see here is that, like in the United States, imprisonment rates in the Netherlands have been rising for the last 40 years. And in fact, in percentage terms, they've risen about the same amount as they have in the United States, although from a lower base. But nonetheless, they have been rising. And they're also rising elsewhere in Europe, although not uniformly. This is still another graph showing rising incarcerations rates in Australia, and I could go on and on. The imprisonment rates are also rising in the developed world, like Colombia. And the reason I emphasize this is that understanding and getting a better handle on what and how imprisonment affects crime is not something that's uniquely American. This is an important public policy issue throughout the world. Okay, this is another graph that Mike and I think were probably thinking on common lines. This is a graph showing the homicide rate in the United States, which, as Mike pointed out, I just chose the homicide rate. I could have shown any crime rate, and they all look pretty much the same. And the reason I want to show this to you now, and I will elaborate on this more in a moment, is that there's been a lot of discussion in the last decade or so since the crime drop started about what effect the imprisonment rate, the rising imprisonment rate, had on that crime drop, and to what extent it has contributed to that crime drop. For now, I will just simply point out that in all of that commentary, they're surprisingly mute about the question of, from 1974 up to the crime drop, when imprisonment rates were rising at the same rate as they were prior to it, why there wasn't a noticeable effect on the crime rate during that period. And one of the points that I make in the paper, and I'm going to elaborate on the essay, is not to say that there was no impact, but it's a lot more complicated than simply trying to correlate imprisonment rates and crime rates. Okay, so how might imprisonment affect crime rates? Well, one is as I described, is by incapacitation, the physical, the isolation of people. Another is by what criminologists call general deterrence, and that's the focus of this essay. That is how the threat of punishment may or may not, and under what circumstances, affect crime. And then there's also this concept called special deterrence, or specific deterrence. And what specific deterrence, or the label, is all about is the effect is really something about the aftermath of the failure of deterrence, because it's about the experience of being punished, and that experience that's an experience that only can occur after deterrence has not failed. Now, one of the in the current draft of the paper, one of the my failures is that in drawing this distinction, what I was hoping to do in this essay is to try to banish the word specific deterrence from the nomenclature of this. And Frank chastised me for not being clear about this. And I'll just quote in a book that Frank wrote 40 years ago. He, in discussing this distinction, he and Gordon Hawkins wrote, "To talk of the impact of punishment on potential offenders and the impact of punishment on the offender as two kinds of deterrence is rather like saying that a storm warning and a storm are two different kinds of disturbances. The use of the expression, the impact of punishment, twice in one sentence to denote two quite separate and distinct processes generates a confusion of categories and obscures important distinctions." And that was a very important point that they made. And one of my ultimate hopes of this essay is to ultimately try to banish the word specific deterrence from the lexicon of discussing deterrence. And part of the reason for that is Frank Cullen referred to earlier in the day when he talked about he and I and Cheryl Johnson reviewed the evidence on what do we know about this term called specific deterrence. That is, what do we know about the effect of the experience of being in prison on reoffending? And first of all, as Frank pointed out, one of our key conclusions was that there was a disturbingly little good evidence on this question. What evidence there is available, points to either the experience of imprisonment having no effect on reoffending or making matters worse. And there's very little evidence that the experience of punishment has a preventive effect. And therefore, we concluded that our conclusion was that while we didn't think that this was sufficiently firm to guide policy, it certainly called into question wild claims about how the experience of punishment has this strong deterrent effect. More on this in a moment. Now, I want to get back to another theme of this essay. There's a very large not a large literature, but somewhat of a sort of it's a little bit of studies that attempt to relate imprisonment rates to crime rates. And these are basically regressions models in which they analyze how imprisonment rates, usually in states, how crime rates in states are affected by their imprisonment rates. And one of the points I wanted in this paper is I discuss at length why I think these studies are useless and why I think they should stop doing them. And there are a number of reasons for that. One is that they suffer from very deep problems of separating cause from effect. That is that while imprisonment undoubtedly has some effect on crime rates, the reason people are in prison is that we have crime. And very few of the studies can even plausibly argue that they've separated out those cause and effect relationships. For the few that have arguably dealt with this problem of separating cause from effect, probably one of the leading examples of such a study was one done by Steve Levitt of the University of Chicago, in which he used court orders to relieve overcrowding from imprisonments as a statistical device for doing this suggestion, to separate out the cause from effect problem. Even if we accept that he was successful in doing that, his estimates really tell us, all they're telling us is what is the impact of sudden releases of people from prison. And he concluded that it increased crime rates. I would say that those kinds of estimates are not useful at all for telling us and informing how the real policy levers of sanctions affect crime rates. That they're not useful in telling us, for example, whether or not 3 strikes laws affect crime rates or not. They're not useful in telling us whether adding gun add-ons are useful in affecting crime rates. They're not useful for telling us whether threatening to send certain kind of people to prison are useful in affecting crime rates. So my point here is that it's not a kind of exercise that produces information that's useful for policy. And then finally, these kinds of studies confound deterrence and incapacitation. And I want to talk more about why the fact that it does that is so important. So why is the distinction between deterrence and incapacitation important? Oftentimes you hear in policy discussions that it doesn't matter whether it's because the crime is prevented by the physical isolation of an offender or the deterrence of an offender, that the crime doesn't occur. The reason it's so important, this distinction is so important, is that crime control by incapacitation necessarily requires us to have larger prison populations. And I would argue that our imprisonment policy over the last 40 years has been predicated on warehousing ever more people in prison as a device for preventing crime. And we don't really know how much crime it's prevented. I agree with Phil earlier this morning was asked the question, does he think that, that incarcerating all these people has reduced the crime rate? Well, it's hard to imagine that incarcerating 2 million people hasn't affected the crime rate. But that incapacitation is a very inefficient way of crime control. Whereas crime control by deterrence does have the prospect of both reducing crime and reducing punishment and imprisonment. Because if a crime doesn't occur, if a crime is prevented from occurring by deterrence, then since there's no crime, there's nobody to punish. And so drawing that distinction is very important for crime control policy and trying to identify crime policies, ways that we can deter and prevent crime is, as I said, is one way of trying to reduce both crime and imprisonment. So, two important conclusions. The review then goes on to review the literature on what we know about general deterrence. And one of the key conclusions of my review is that there is simply no evidence, there is simply no good evidence that lengthy prison sentences deter crime. There may be an incapacitation effect, but then I go on and point out that it doesn't make much sense to incapacitate aged criminals, and it's hard to even to justify lengthy incarceration of aged criminals. I go on to argue, though, that, and Larry Sherman discussed this somewhat this morning, that there is good evidence, I believe, that if police are properly deployed, that they can have a material deterrent effect. Going back to, this is a little graph that's in the review, and getting to elaborate on this issue of why lengthy prison sentences don't deter. And in it, I have these two possible curves of what you might think of as the dose-response relationship between the crime rate and sentence length. And one possibility is that there's this kind of steady decline that's shown here, and the other possibility is that the curve exhibits what an economist would call diminishing return B. And so that if we're, in both cases, the fact that we have some prison sentence is creating a deterrent effect. But if we ask the question, suppose we're going to increase our sentence from the S1 level to the S2 level, if the response curve looks linear like this, then that suggests that there's a material effect. But if we, in this region of diminishing returns, then there's no material effect, and the evidence, all the evidence that one looks at suggests that this curve looks like B, and so that the response to every crime problem that Mike nicely documented just before lunch of trying to add on still a longer sentence there's no evidence that that's effective in creating deterrence. One area, though, that we really do know very little about and is discussed is what this curve looks like at very low sentences. And so I think it's one thing that future research we need to better understand is for deterrence to work, there has to be some negative consequence associated with committing a crime. But what we really don't know is, getting back to actually another point that Mike made earlier today, is what's the minimum necessary to get a response? And we really don't have good research on that question. So police and deterrence. Again, getting back to to a point that McCarran made over 200 years ago, where he said that it's better to prevent crime than punish them. And in the paper, in the review paper, I attempt to distinguish two roles of the police. And one is as what I call apprehension agents. That is, capturing people who have committed after the crime has been committed. And the other is a role which I call playing a role of what I call official guardians. And in that role, this is a role in which I just try to describe ways in which police might be used to prevent crimes from happening in the first place. And examples of that kind of role is I think the best documented example of where police can be effective in that is on so-called hotspots policing. That is, in which there are large increases in police presence at locations where there's a lot of crime going on. And there's a lot of good evidence that that is an effective way of preventing crime from happening in the first place, and by preventing the crime from happening in the first place, we avoid the problem of having to punish somebody. There's also evidence that focused deterrence strategies, which are mainly used in the context of trying to stop gun violence, which Phil talked about earlier this morning, that there the evidence on their effectiveness may be overstated, but the idea of these things is to threaten very harsh consequences for a few group of people for being violent. So, I won't. I'm not. I could talk about this little tree at length, but this is my attempt to try to describe the official guardian role versus the apprehension agent role. But I'll simply say that the idea of this, one idea I was trying to develop in this little tree was to build upon a point that Phil Cook made in 1979, and which seems to have long ago been forgotten. And the point that Phil made was that measures like the clearance rate or the arrest ratio suffer from a fundamental flaw. And it's a flaw which goes far deeper than people in the policing literature talk about the vagaries of how arrests and crimes are counted. The point that Phil made was that clearance rates and arrest ratios are measuring the effectiveness of police in capturing people after a crime has already occurred. And what those ratios do not tell us about is how effective the police are in stopping a crime from happening in the first place because of their presence. And I could go on at length about that point in this tree and try to explain why I think I was trying to build on Phil's insight about why this distinction is so important, and why if police behave in this official guardian role and stop the crime from happening in the first place, why things like hotspots policing have the potential for being so effective in preventing crime. So policy recommendations. In the essay, I call for a repeal of mandatory minimum sentencing. And let me make a quick aside here about this. And Phil was, again earlier this morning, was expressing his dismay at whether or not evidence can affect policy. I think that Mike, before lunch, was, I think, I felt was feeling a little bit more optimistic that now that we're in a period that maybe attitudes are changing. I'll say now, with regard to this issue, that I just wrote an op-ed in which I make this argument that we should repeal mandatory minimums. I don't know whether it's going to be published, but but I'll note that my co-author, and this is more important, my co-author in writing this op-ed is a former Attorney General, Dick Thornburgh, who was the Attorney General during the end of the Reagan administration and the beginning of the Bush administration, and at that time was an advocate of this kind of punishing. And I was really quite surprised that he agreed to sign on to this op-ed. Now, whether it gets published or not, we'll have to see. But I was surprised that Dick was willing to do it, and he did do it. And so maybe that's some reason for optimism that evidence can change people's views. I also argue in the essay, and we can, I don't want to talk about this now, but that in an era of declining criminal justice budgets, that police should get a larger share of the smaller pie. So some research recommendations quickly is I'll again apologize to Frank for using the term specific deterrence. I promise I'll never use it again. But the idea was that it's important that when part of the incomplete theorizing about deterrence is that deterrence, theories of deterrence do not take account of how the experience of punishment affects future responsiveness to the threat of punishment, and that so therefore those two concepts need to be integrated. We also need to generalize deterrence theory to account for the full range of sanctions. Most of our theories think about a single sanction. How does imprisonment deter crime? But of course, the alternative to imprisonment is not no punishment. It's some other lesser punishment. And we need to better understand incrementally how the range of punishments, how people respond to the range of punishments that are available. And as I indicated earlier, there's an extended discussion of why we need to better understand sanction risks. That in the end, deterrence is a perceptual phenomenon, and there's no good reason for thinking, and there's good reasons for thinking to the contrary, that people don't know what the objective risks are. Well, then what do they perceive, and what are they responding to? And that we also need to better understand the certainty effect. That goes back to my earlier comments about policing. So,
good. Thank you.
I think that you made some interesting points about how there's a point of diminishing returns on the sentencing, and I was just wondering, there's also some information about, I think it was in Hawaii, that the judge kind of changed this regime of having inmates that are on, or parolees on parole that constantly violate but don't get sanctioned until 10 times later, and then they get a big sanction. And he changed that to, well, immediately once you get sanctioned, there's going to be some short, a day or two or week of prison. And I'm wondering how you can kind of address those two issues, whereas the immediate but short sanction seems to be a good remedy in certain circumstances, and whereas these long sentences don't make any difference regardless of the crime as far as the crime rate is going.
Well, that's called Project Hope, and I'll say two things about that. Is that I think that the Project Hope study is an example of why I think it's so important to begin to understand what the minimum threshold negative consequence we need to deter people. Okay, is that for deterrence to operate, there has to be a negative consequence, but I think we need to understand what the minimum negative consequence is to get a reaction. And so in that sense, I do think Project Hope is an object lesson in the value of research on that question. But I'll also remind everybody about Frank Cullen's specific observation about that project. In that case is that I think Frank legitimately raises the issue of whether or not in Project Hope what we're seeing is the effectiveness of, we're seeing a judge effect, that this judge has been particularly effective, at giving the right sort of lecture and counsel to get people to comply with parole conditions. There has to be replications of that, and we'll learn more about whether or not Project Hope can work, and can work separate from Judge Alm, can work outside of rural Hawaii. There's lots of questions about that still need to be addressed, and we got to avoid the reaction of thinking that it's a silver bullet to cure all kinds of problems. But that said, I do think that it does provide the very useful. It very usefully raises the question of what is the minimal sentence we need to get people to comply.
I have a question about the increase in police funding. Would that change just the presence in these hotspots, like the number of police, or would you also call for a change in their role in the neighborhoods?
Right. Well, I think that is that the specific recommendation is, I think criminal justice, for all sorts of reasons, criminal justice budgets are going to be going down for all. And so the recommendation is that their share of it, that the cuts in policing not be as great as the cuts in correction. So that's the specific version of it. But your point, to speak in your more general point, is that what I'm saying is that I think there's evidence that as I said, if the police are properly deployed, they can have crime prevention effects. Making that point is not meant to be a brief for abusive police tactics like racial profiling and abuse of people's of the citizen of the civil rights of our citizens. So I mean, we don't want to live in a low crime police state. So I'm not advocating for that. So they obviously have to be monitored.
I have a very similar question in terms of the discussion of police as guardians and their crime prevention role in that effect. Is there any research that really tries to combine that macro level look at hotspot policing and the optimal amount of time and so forth, and relate it to the crime rate with the more postmodern twist that you raised in your recommendations and others talked about too, in terms of what is the perception of that police presence? If you're feeling like it's an occupation, what deterrent effect does that have? Or if you feel that people have been rude and it's engendering the defiance response that was mentioned.
Well, to some extent, there's been research on that. Jeff has done some research on, and as have Tom Tyler, on issues of legitimacy and so forth. And so let me reframe your question, is suppose it's the case that we did some kind of study, and what we found is, well, we do know that hotspots policing does seem to be associated with, at least while the police are doing it, with reductions in crime rates. What we really don't know is what, in those experiments, what the police were actually doing, okay? Now, okay, so I don't know, we don't know what they're doing, but suppose they were doing the kinds of things that Jeff has been so critical of. I don't know that that's the case, but suppose they were. I think the point is that over time, what that could mean is that could erode the very basis in the long term for their short-term effectiveness. So I think the answer is we need to have more studies of that sort. And while there's been, in some limited ways, work done by Jeff and others on that question, it's really not been done, I think, in the spirit that of the way you've asked your question.